All right, everyone. By my clock, it is 12 o'clock, and it's time to get started. Welcome to Webinar Wednesdays. Webinar Wednesdays is a service that we provide through the Illinois Early Intervention Training Program to provide content for you during the winter months so that you don't have to travel so far to get to training and professional development experiences. The University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign is also sponsors our early intervention training program, and so I'm going to give a shout out to them. Today's topic is Building Better Brains, the core story of early brain and child development. Our presenter today is Dr. Mariana Glusman. She has dedicated her career to decreasing health and educational disparities among low-income children. Dr. Glusman is an associate professor of pediatrics at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine and is also an attending pediatrician at Ann and Robert L. Lurie Children's Uptown Clinic, where for the past 22 years she has cared for a diverse, multilingual, medically complex, underserved patient population. Dr. Glusman is also the current president of the Illinois chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Welcome today. We are so excited to have you here, Dr. Glusman, and can't wait to hear your presentation. Also on as a presenter is Kaylin Sanfransky, who is a policy specialist with the Legal Council for Health Justice and is working with the lead pilots that are occurring in Illinois. So welcome to the both of you.
Thank you.
Okay. As I said, my name is Maria Maddox, and I am one of your moderators today. Alyssa Jones is not here with us today, but she has been my co-facilitator, moderator for all of our webinars, so those of you who have been on these before will recognize the names. So if you haven't been on webinars before, I want to just go over a couple of things, but the first is how you get your credit. These webinars are approved for Illinois EI credit and Illinois State Licensure credit for OTs, PTs, SLPs, social work, and nutrition dietitians. So here's what will happen. After our webinar, you will get an All right, can you hear me now? Sound, yay! All right, I'm not sure where I cut out, but let's go with, the slide is up, survey. Your email, survey, and your certificate of completion within 24 hours. I think most of you have been on these webinars before, so those should be fairly familiar. Okay, if you haven't, couple of orientation slides here to get you familiar with our webinar experience. Your control panel, if you are dialed in, logged in on your computer, your control panel is on the right-hand side. And if you're on a handheld device, it's going to be the bottom half of your screen. And also, if you're on a tablet, there may be some information on the side. Okay? On your control panel are a couple of tools that we're going to ask you to utilize. So the first is our chat box. Many of you have found the chat box by indicating our sound issues. Thank you. Use your chat box to ask any questions that you may have of the presenter. Use it to respond to any questions our presenter may ask as well, and to share strategies, thoughts, ideas, say hello to your friends. As far as questions are concerned, if you do have a question, don't wait. Just go ahead and type it in the chat box. We have question breaks that are built into our presentation to address questions at that point in time. So it helps us to have questions ready to go. So don't worry if you type your question in and you don't hear us talking about it right away. We will get to it in the break. Webinars are great. So, you know, we can't see you, you can't see us. So our communication gaps can be a little disconcerting for those of us who are doing these webinars. So using your chat box is a way to engage and stay connected together. So please feel free to use that as much as possible. Also, you have a tool called the hand raise tool. So if you look on the screen, Katie found it. Thanks, Katie. You find the hand raise tool. So there may be questions that our presenter will ask you, you know, and you might ask you to raise your hand. You click it once, your hand goes up. You click it again, your hand goes down. So everybody find the hand raise tool and click it. All right, let's see. Okay, it looks like most of you have found it. If you can't, it's that third box under your name on the control panel, or on the handheld, it is in the middle there, right under, it's that third box right under. So, all right, if you haven't already, please go ahead and unclick, and we will move on. There you go. One other tool that we might use is a polling function. So in the polling function, that's that fourth box under your name, and it could look a couple of different ways. One, it could look like it is on the screen where it has a checkbox in it, or it could look like it does in the middle where it has a letter in it. So if you find that in your under your name, right under your name, that fourth box, and right now it currently has a letter in it. We'll be asking you a few questions throughout the webinar. We ask that everyone participate using the polling function when that opportunity arises. We are able to share results and to be able to see kind of how the group is understanding. So it's helpful to us as presenters to kind of get a feel for where our group is. One other thing, we're going to try something new for our webinar today, and that is we're going to show a couple videos. So after the second video, I am going to have a poll asking you about your experience with the video. We've never done it before, and I want to get an idea of what your quality of the video is like. So just be on the lookout for that poll at the end. Thank you. All right. So with that being said, I am going to run my first poll, and our poll is, who do we have participating with us today? So let us know who's in the room. Okay, find that fourth box under your name, open it up, or just touch on it, and a drop-down box will open up, and we will be able to get a good fix for who all is in the room. All right, and if you're not on there, yeah, use your role. So we got Lucy from EITP. We got Tawny, who's an early childhood specialist. We got licensed clinical social professional counselor. Okay, use the polling function if you are on that list. Okay, all right, we'll give folks a few more seconds. All right, so let's see here. All right, we have a very good mix of participants today. It looks like we have quite a few from CFC staff with a mix of different therapists and DTs. So Dr. Glusman, this is your audience for today, so you know who you're speaking with. Also, let's see. With that being said, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Glusman, and you will go ahead and share your wonderful information.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm really excited to share this information with you. It is something that is very near and dear to my heart. I think that given your background, some of it may sound familiar, and some of it may be reassuring for you all to know that pediatricians are also beginning to talk about some of the things that other providers have been talking about in the past. And hopefully also there'll be information that is new and interesting for you as well. So my goal for today is I'm going to review some concepts on early brain and language development and literacy development, discuss what specific things parents and caregivers can do to help their children's brain grow and develop to their potential. And that's important because every child is going to develop differently at their own pace. Some kids may have delays, some kids may be ahead, but the key is helping kids grow to their potential. And then I also want to talk about how EI providers can partner with Reach Out and Read Illinois and use some of the Reach Out and Read principles to help with children that have elevated lead levels, again, to maximize their developmental trajectories. So a lot of times people ask me, how does a pediatrician, become interested in literacy promotion? This is really one of my passions, and it's obviously not anything that I learned in medical school. And it started with my daughter, Abby, who was born when I was a medical student, the 4th year of my medical school, and was 6 months old when I started doing my residency training. So I was learning to be a mom, and I was learning to be a pediatrician at the same time. Residency training was really quite grueling. I would spend at least 80 hours in the hospital all the time, a week. So I missed her a lot, but when I came home, I would be exhausted. So one of the things that I started doing was reading with her, in part because I loved it and she loved it, and also because it was something I could do lying down. So I would spend hours reading with her and cuddling and having a lovely time. And as she started growing, I was amazed at how she was developing. And then I started to see that my patients who were her same age, who were also loved by their parents, well cared for, they weren't developing like my daughter was. And I started to try and figure out why. Why was it that my daughter was so ahead? And it occurred to me to ask people if they were reading with their kids, and that was my senior project in 1996, and found out that parents were not reading with their children. So that's how I started becoming really interested in literacy. Around that time, there was another program, a program called Reach Out and Read, which started out in Boston. Again, started with a pediatrician who brought all his daughter's books to the clinic and saw that they were disappearing. The parents were taking them, and so he decided to study it and see, what is the effect of having books in pediatricians' offices? What happens when pediatricians talk about literacy with families? And so that's how I got hooked on literacy promotion. And since then, it's become more than literacy promotion. Really, it really is about a bigger set of issues that I'm going to be talking about during this webinar. Oops, here we go. So I will be coming back and telling you all about Reach Out and Read, but before I do, why am I telling you about Reach Out and Read? Partly because we are very excited to partner with the Legal Council for Health Justice and with the Erickson Institute to help strengthen the developmental outcomes for children with lead poisoning. As some of you may know, there's a pilot that is currently being conducted in partnership with 3 Child and Family Connections offices, and you can see the zip codes where they are in the map. There are in suburban Cook County, Winnebago, and Boone County, and a select number of zip codes in Chicago. And the pilot emphasizes connecting lead-poisoned children and their families with proactive services aimed to support the child's development and to keep them on track with their peers and ready for school. It's kind of a slightly different approach to early intervention, which for early intervention providers, in a lot of ways, it's instead of having it be fixing a deficit, or it's preventing a deficit. And that is really exciting. So what we're really focusing with this pilot is how do we stave off some of the effects that lead poisoning can have on children's brain development, their IQ. It's been shown to affect behavior, reading, and really to have broader effects that ripple out across the lifespan. So again, it's about prevention, and that's what the pilot is going to be focusing on. So let me start with brain development. All right. So this is a quote that I love by Dana Susskind, who is an ear, nose, and throat doctor at the University of Chicago, but is also very involved with these kinds of initiatives. Children are not born smart, they are made smart. I'm going to tell you a little bit about brain architecture and how the brain develops. On this slide, there's at the bottom a website, and I encourage you all to go to that when you have time. It's the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, and they've got wonderful, wonderful videos that really talk about brain development and all the issues that I'm going to be talking about, really in a very clear, concise way. So if you're want to review some more, learn more, I encourage you to go to that website. The basic concept is that we're born with 100 billion neurons, which is another word for brain cells. The way that neurons develop is unlike other parts of the body where to grow you make more cells. The brain cells, instead, they shoot out connections and connect with other brain cells and make these pathways. And the pathways, once the two neurons connect, it's called a synapse. And then the pathways that are used are strengthened. The more that the pathways are used, the pathways that are most used are the ones that are strengthened, and the pathways that are least used go away. And that's how slowly, or not, it's actually not slow at all, it's actually rather fast, the brain starts changing in the architecture based on the input that the child is getting from their environment. And the different neurons become connected, the different parts of the brain become integrated, and that's how the brain develops. So at what age do people think that the brain starts to prune unused brain synapses or connections? What do you all think? Do you think that the pruning starts about a year of age, 2 to 4 years, at puberty, or around 18 to 21 years of age? What do people think?
So go to the fourth box under your name. That's the polling function. Click on that box that has that letter A on it, and find the answer that you feel is most appropriate. We do ask that everyone participate in the polls. That lets us kind of have a little better level of understanding. So, and you should have access to that on both your computer and your handheld devices. Find a box that has a letter in it. We'll give folks a few more seconds to find that. Responses are still coming in, so we'll give another couple seconds here. All right, well, it looks like we're kind of divided here. Some say less than 1 year of age, some say between 2 and 4. Those are pretty much equal. The others, a couple said some other ones, but let's see what is the right answer.
So the question is, at what age does the brain start to prune unused connections? And the answer is between 2 and 4. That doesn't mean that there isn't pruning before and that there isn't pruning after. So, but the key point that I want to make is that as you start from the moment that a baby's born, all the way through 2 years of age, you can see in these, let's see if I can find the pointer here. You can see here, can you see my pointer? Yeah. This is when they're even right before birth, right around birth, you can see very few connections. And by the time children are 2 years old, you can see that there's just a tangled web of connections. However, by the age of 4 and 6, you can start seeing some of these connections that are not used go away. And this kind of makes sense if you think about a 2-year-old, how their attention span is all over the place, and how 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, as you get older, you're able to really sort of, there's less of the sort of randomness that kids have. It's much more organized, and that goes along with their brain development. So how do these neural pathways form, and what are the factors that stimulate these connections, and what are the factors that sustain the connections? And the answer is that it's an interaction between genes and experience. Again, it's the same old the age-old question, nature versus nurture, and we find that there isn't really a dichotomy, it's both. But the active ingredient in the sustaining of the synapses is what is called serve and return interaction with parents and caregivers, which is really based on secure relationships. So what does serve and return interactions refer to? Again, this is another great link to a wonderful video at the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. And basically, it's not that the child is a sponge that is absorbing all the things that are happening in the environment. The key is that the child is an active participant in his or her learning. The child does something, the parent notices it, responds to it, and then the child responds to that, and it's a back and forth communication. And a lot of times you think, you know, little babies, they don't talk, they don't do much, but even newborns, you will see they recognize their parent's voice. They get excited when they hear their parent's voice or see somebody that they recognize. There is a lot of things that are happening. There are a lot of things that are happening that the child is doing, and as long as the parent or caregiver is responding to them, he or she is reinforcing the connections that are getting formed. So what do y'all think, true or false? Stress interferes with brain development.
So we have the polling function back up in there. And while folks are responding to the poll, I want to just draw your attention to the fact that next to your name in the teleconference or in the main room, you should have some icons. And if your icon has 2 yellow dots on it, it means that your audio and or video is delayed. If your icon has 3 red dots on it, it means that your audio is significantly delayed. It will catch up, but you are experiencing some delays, and that is really based on how your connection is. So if you're seeing that next to your name when you scroll down through all the names, that's probably why you may be having some issues with audio or video. So if you haven't already responded to the poll, let me go ahead and pull the results up. It looks like overwhelmingly folks responded to true.
All right. So it is true, but it also depends. So the question is a little ambiguous, and it was on purpose, because of course it doesn't, I didn't say what kind of stress or who's the person that's stressed. But yes, of course, stress will interfere with the parent's ability to serve and return interactions, and in that sense affect brain development. But there's another way that people think about stress, and that is that there are different kinds of stress. There's positive stress, which is the kind of stress that, that you feel right before a test that it helps you kind of focus, and it's like, oh, I better get to studying because tomorrow is my test, and I better do well. So it is a stress, like for example, another example of that in a child's life would be losing a game, being dropped off at daycare, it's stressful. The brain and the hormones, there's this temporary elevation in the stress hormones. The heart goes up, but it actually helps you learn. It helps you create become more resilient. Then there's something called tolerable stress, in which it's the child or the family is dealing with a more complicated, scary, challenging, or long-lasting situations such as divorce, living in poverty, death of a loved one. And the key that is important about this is that there is buffering by a caring adult. In terms of the brain and body response, it is more severe in terms of the activation of the stress response. But eventually, again, with the help of the caring people around you, there is less likely to be any lasting physical or emotional issues. Now, on the other hand, toxic stress is when you have more severe, long-lasting, and uncontrollable or frequent stress, chronic stress, which in situations such as neglect, exposure to violence, severe economic hardship. And with the important part of it right here is that there's no adult or buffering. That can lead to a prolonged activation of the stress response. So instead of the stress response going up, and then when the challenge goes away, coming back to baseline, the stress response is activated all the time. And that actually leads to lifelong changes, including heart disease, memory, learning issues, anxiety, depression, behavior problems, and cancer. Now, this is what forms the basis for the ACEs study, ACES, which refers to adverse childhood events, which has been shown that early events that cause toxic stress in childhood can lead to health issues in adulthood. One of the important things that are different between the tolerable stress and the toxic stress is that some of the issues in tolerable stress, so for example, say a house burns down. That is very stressful, it's challenging, it lasts a long time, but imagine that then the community rises to support the family. The parents perhaps it's a two-parent household where the children are feeling like it's all going to be okay, somebody's taking care of you. Compare that same situation with a house burning down in a single-parent home that is not connected to a community. At that point, the parent has to be working and taking care of all the issues that are as a result of the fire, isn't able to really take care of the child's needs. So even the same stress can be tolerable or toxic depending on the ability of the adults around the child to buffer that stress. This is what I was talking to you about before, is that these adverse experiences can also damage not just the heart and lead to long-lasting health problems, but it also damages the developing brain architecture. And this is a CT scan of 2 3-year-old children. One that is a healthy 3-year-old, and then another one that has been severely neglected. This is not just about nutrition, it also has to do with the nutrition of the brain, which is more than the food that the child consumes, but also the environment and the input and the responses to the child's needs that are precluding the child's brain from developing in a healthy way. So the good news is that caring adults can protect children from the effects of toxic stress. Another thing that you can think about that is not specifically toxic stress is that also affects the child's brain development is lead poisoning. As I mentioned before, lead poisoning has been associated with long-lasting neurodevelopmental challenges, and if we can empower the caring adults that are taking care of these children to really enhance the children's environment, we can hopefully protect them or buffer against those effects of lead, perhaps by helping sustain more of those synapses ahead of time and keeping them from getting pruned. So what questions do people have?
So I've been monitoring the chat box, and I don't see any questions that have popped up so far, so I think we can probably move on, and if there's any that come in, I'll let you know.
Excellent. Excellent. Good. So now let's move on to language development. Language development is very much like early brain development. It doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's a social process. It depends on the exposure, the amount, the quality, of course, which languages a child is exposed to, what age they're exposed to, and it is also founded on serve and return interactions. Again, the child is not a sponge that absorbs from the environment, and that's why media exposure is not as effective in terms of developing language. One interesting thing that has been found, a few studies have found, is that the more a child is leading the language, the more the child leads the interactions, the more that the parents are responsive to the child-directed language, which really refers to serve and return interactions with language. It's not just that it leads to better vocabulary. It actually changes the brain so that the child has a faster language and processing speed, which means that the more you learn, the faster you learn. And then, so that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where the kids that are really exposed to language not only learn more, but get better at learning. So, I'm sure some of you have heard of the Hart and Risley study, which I will talk to you about, but I'm curious. What they did is they went into homes from high-income families, and they tape recorded what words children heard. And we're talking about children between birth and the end of the 3rd year, so by the 4th birthday. And they basically counted how many words children heard. And they went to families that were low income and families that were high income. So by the end of the 3rd year of life, so by the age of 4, if they counted up how many words the high-income kids heard, how many words the low-income kids heard, and then they figured out the difference. And what do you guys think the difference is? 30,000, 300,000, 3 million, or 30 million?
So again, go to the 4th box under your name. It has a little A in it. Open that up and click your response. We'll give you a few seconds to determine what is your best response. Let's see responses coming in. The more that you can, we use the polling function. That would be helpful. Okay. All right, waiting on a few more responses here. Nancy, it's the 4th box under your name. If you're on your computer, it looks like a little A. If you're on a handheld device, there should be a series of 4 boxes, and find the one that looks like an A. Right. Okay, let's see what we've got here. All right, our responses are, again, kind of all over the board. Looks like most everyone felt that 300,000 was the right answer, but 3 million was a close second.
And the answer, drum roll, is a 30 million word gap. So this is what Hart and Risley found in 2003. They found that children from the professional families were exposed to 45 million words, and the families living in poverty, 13 million words. And that's where the sort of 30 million word gap is. And you might hear about the 30 million word gap because we do hear it's kind of making its way more into sort of the general consciousness. Now, there have been some studies that have said, oh, it's not 30 million, it's more like 3 million or 4 million. There's been a little bit of controversy in terms of the actual number of words, because the other thing that is really important is that it's not just about the number of words, it's the way that the words are said, the kinds of words that are said. And Hart and Risley also noted in their study that kids from professional families were much more likely to hear sentences that were positive, like, yes, that is a dog. The dog goes woof woof, versus families, children that lived in poverty, which were more likely to hear kind of negative sentences such as sit down, put that away. It wasn't that the kids in the professional families were loved any more than the kids in the families living in poverty, but it was just the types of interactions that they noted were happening in this group. Again, it's a sample, and this is not to say that all children living in poverty are spoken to in negative ways, or the opposite way. Professional families, we're seeing a lot of kids now on their devices, which I'll mention in a minute. So the gap may actually be getting smaller. The other thing that they found was that by age 3, kids from the economically advantaged children that were economically advantaged had basically twice the number of words than kids who came from economically disadvantaged families. So you can see that this is going to affect the way that they do in school, and it's going to have long-term consequences. As I was saying before, children don't learn well from the devices, especially at this age. Older children, adults, can learn perfectly well from their devices, but children require more of the serve and return interaction, like I said. So I like to say there's no app like your lap. There was an interesting study that by Pat Kuhl in the University of Washington where they took little 10-month-olds that were basically exposed monolingual English 10-month-olds, and then they put them in these little machines to see if they could hear the sounds that were in Chinese, because Chinese has lots of other sounds that phonemes, which are the pieces of sound like k, at, the c is a phoneme. So those are the pieces of the sounds that make up words. And little babies can hear all the phonemes of all the different languages. But as we get older, if we're not exposed to the language, that particular language, all those synapses get pruned, so we don't even hear the differences. So that's why sometimes, adults may have issues with pronouncing certain words in languages with accents, because we can't even hear some of the sounds that are very obvious to Chinese-speaking families, and every language has their own. So in any case, these families, these kids were brought in at 10 months of age when they could hear all the different sounds. Their brain is capable of hearing all the different sounds. And then over the next 2 months, they exposed them to a Chinese-speaking, Mandarin-speaking research assistant. And half the kids played with her and interacted with her in person, and half the kids actually interacted with her, didn't interact, they just saw and heard the same games and the same books on the TV, on a video. And what they found was that the kids who were equal in every other way, they were matched. By the end of those 2 months, the kids who had played with and interacted with the research assistant in person could hear the sounds of Chinese almost as well as kids that are native that were hearing Chinese all along, as compared to the kids who heard the same words on the monitor, and they found that those kids actually, it's as if they had never heard the Chinese words. So this is kind of a cautionary tale about all those apps that purport to be educational and to make kids smart. At this age, really, there's no app like your lab. It really is about the relationship and the serve and return interaction. And why is it important that children have good vocabularies? Aside from the fact that they're learning, they get to become better learners, vocabulary is an indicator for school success as early as kindergarten. So let's now kind of turn a little bit to literacy development. So when I was talking about language and language development, I also wanted to, and the areas of the brain that do language, there are specific areas of the brain. There's Broca's area right here, which is responsible for language production. So if somebody has a stroke or something happens to that part of the brain, the person might be able to understand everything but be unable to speak. And then there is Wernicke's area right here, which is part of the auditory cortex, and that's responsible for language comprehension. And so people that have a stroke in that area of the brain are able to speak perfectly well, but they don't understand what other people are saying. So language is actually pre-wired in the brain. So I have a question for you. Is there an area of the brain that is dedicated to reading and reading comprehension?
Okay, we've got the poll up, that fourth box under your name. Open it up. You should have 3 choices there. And while we're waiting on those responses, Dr. Glusman, there was a question about the impact. Let me see if I can find it here again real quick. The impact of expressive language, since you were doing the word counts, on children who are able to hear that have 2 deaf parents. Can you address that at some point during your presentation today?
So yeah, I mean, I think that sign language is another language, right? So it is children that are exposed, that are native sign language speakers. Basically, their parents speak to them in sign language. Whether they're hearing or not, they're learning sign language, right? And so their vocabulary, their way that they're fluent sign language speakers. If they're not hearing language from like oral language, or if they're hearing, for example, their parents are saying words, but they are, you know, sometimes, especially for people that are deaf but have, but are also speaking, they say the words, but they're like basically not pronouncing the words correctly. It's almost as if you have a person that is a native Spanish speaker that is speaking to their children in English. You know, the synapses don't form as well. Okay, so the key is the key is that children who have 2 deaf parents should also be exposed to people that are speaking language, right? So whether it's at school or whether it's other family members, so they should be hearing oral language so that their brain synapses can also become strong, and then they become bilingual. So I don't know if that answers. Does that answer the question?
I think so, and we'll let Colette address that in the chat field if she feels like that addressed it. I think so. And in the meantime, we got your results of your poll up. So everyone felt that there was, a majority of folks felt that yes, it is true that there's an area dedicated to reading and reading comprehension.
All right. So actually, it's not really true. There's not one area like with language. The really cool thing about reading is that it borrows from all the different parts of the brain. So, for example, right here is where it's the occipital region is where it's the visual cortex is back here. So so visual inputs are focused there. Then, of course, there's got to be some of the auditory cortex, the accent. So, like for example, this is the area where the hearing part is, like in right here, where you have to understand what is going on. So there's a lot more of the auditory. Then you have some of the frontal ear area here, which actually relates to access to meaning. And then up here in the parietal areas, which are really more about attention. So really what the brain does is it cobbles together a lot of areas from all the different parts of the brain to develop the reading brain. Interestingly enough, people that read languages that are character languages and that learn in different ways, reading Chinese, for example, the people with the Chinese reading brain is a little bit different than the English reading brain, and that has to do with the way that the characters, people learn the characters. So it's really, really fascinating. But the bottom line is that to really enhance the development of the reading brain, you want to be able to have sustained the synapses from all over the brain. To really basically serve as the foundation for reading. And it starts with attunement and shared attention with little infants and babies, shared attention and interaction where both the parent and the child know that they're attending to the same thing. As they get a little bit older, dialogic reading, which I will mention about in a moment, telling stories. And then once that's happened, there is the development of the understanding that letters are related to sounds. So there is a basic ladder that you get the foundation that builds upon itself to be able to learn reading. So what dialogic reading refers to, and some of you may already know about this, is that it's not just about reading the words on the page. It's really about talking and interacting around what's going on in the book. So if I say, in the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon, that is really kind of not, that's boring, and no kid's going to listen to that. It's, you know, when you don't have, it's when the kid is not paying attention, they're not going to learn as much as if you say something like, in the great green room, there was a telephone. Where's the telephone? There's the telephone. I see him. Look, what's the little bunny doing? He's sleeping. And that's the kind of thing that that is really helpful in setting the foundation for reading. Because it increases the awareness in books. There's a lot of different things that dialogic reading does, including it increases the serve and return interactions. If you actually think about the last time that you were with a 2-year-old and just like outside or in the park, probably if you think back about the kinds of things that you talked about, it was probably short sentences to keep them safe from themselves, right? Take that out of your mouth. Don't do that. Come here. Don't run in the street. Whereas if you think about the kinds of interaction that happen with a book, or with a game. It doesn't just have to be with a book. Sitting on the lap. There's a lot more serve and return interactions that happen around dialogic reading. Also, it helps with the understanding about the pictures and then leading on to printed words, that the words represent meaning. It also helps kids to use background knowledge to obtain meaning from print. Kids, for example, that grow up in the inner city might not know what a cow is, except for the fact that maybe somebody read to them about a cow and that the cow says moo. Otherwise, why would they know that a cow says moo? When they get to school, you're kind of expected to know that a cow says moo. So that's another kind of issue with having lots of books in the house. Also, it gives kids motivation to learn to read because reading is fun and they want to do things like their parents. And then there's also, if you have some good books, the books can be windows to the world, opening kids' eyes to different things, again, like I said, that they might not be exposed to, but also mirrors, you know, really good books that show diverse kids. Kids can see themselves in the book doing different things that they might not otherwise be exposed to, and that can also serve as motivation, not just for reading, but for doing well in school. So let's think about, I told you about the number of words that kids from low-income families compared to kids from high-income families get exposed to. Now, what do you think how does the number of hours that low-income children in low-income homes are read to compared to the number of hours for high-income children? Do you think that low-income children are read about half the time as high-income kids, a quarter of the time, 10% of the time, or 2.5% of the time?
So again, find that polling function. I see folks have found that already. The fourth box under your name, or the fourth box under the presentation screen on your handheld device. It should have a letter A in it. Go ahead and respond that. Those of you, there may be some of you that are having some slide and audio difficulties. My best recommendation to you is to log off and log back on. Your connection is probably what's causing some of the delays, because I think for the most part folks are able to see the slides. So I think it's an individual issue. So log back out and log back on. That will help. All right, let's see here. Still waiting on a few more responses. Right. Think about those. Okay, let's see what we got. All right, the majority of folks felt that 10% was the number there. So what is the right response?
Well, I mean, obviously it's going to differ in different families, but on average, when they measured the number of hours that kids from high-income families were exposed to was about 1,000 hours as compared to 25 hours for low-income kids. So that is a 2.5% ratio, which goes along with the fact that a lot of children from low-income families get to school and they're behind. And it's important because kindergarten readiness tends to track along for the higher grades. Kids that are doing poorly in their reading in first grade tend to be the same kids that do poorly in third grade. And by the end of third grade is where you go from learning to read to reading to learn. And so if by then you haven't really mastered reading, you're at a real risk of having issues with learning, with self-esteem, school graduation, and path to success in school and in life. So this leads to a generational cycle where kids that grow up in poverty are read to less, have less serve and return interactions, so then they've got decreased language skills, which again, as they grow, lead to reading difficulties, which again, now the next as the next generation to poverty and so on. So we really want to be able to intervene at that point. And unfortunately, more than 1 out of 5 children in the United States live in poverty, which is really unconscionable. There are, of course, reading is not the only factor that, and poverty certainly is not the only factor that affects parents interacting with their children. Depression, anxiety, fatigue are really big ones, particularly because people may be working 2 jobs. There's a lot of things. This is not a blaming thing. It really is sort of an acknowledgement of the way things have been. Also, many parents may have a lack of knowledge of the importance of serve and return interactions or reading, or they may have a lack of models. And there are things we can do to help with depression, anxiety, and fatigue, but those are much harder lifts than helping with lack of knowledge and lack of models. That's where we can all come in as EI providers, as pediatricians, as people that work with kids from starting at birth. So what questions do y'all have on this?
I think there were a couple of questions that you actually addressed as you were presenting, and then we addressed the one that during the poll. I don't see any other questions that have come up. Just a lot of applause for the serve and return, and just disbelief and how sad it is with the words and the amount of hours that children are read. So I'm not seeing any other questions.
All right, excellent. So let's move on to Reach Out and Read, which really the Reach Out and Read is a program that is specifically geared towards pediatricians and family practitioners, so that work in low-income areas. But a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about are really applied to EI providers because we are sources of support for families that and role modeling that they may not have access to otherwise. So the Reach Out and Read model has 3 components. One is advice, so encouraging parents to read aloud daily and offer age-appropriate advice. We give out books to children when they come in for their checkups from birth to 5 years. And then also the advice is not just, and I'll mention this in a moment, it's not just here, read 15 minutes a day. It's really important. We really talk about how to do it and model how to do it. And again, I'll mention that more in a moment. And then we make our practice literacy-rich environment with posters, gently used books, library information, and volunteer readers whenever that's possible. So starting with the advice, it's not about you should, because I hate the word should when it comes to pediatrics. I think it just makes parents feel guilty because a lot of things that we should be doing, as a mom I know that I should be doing a lot of things that I'm not doing. So I like to hear more about things that I can do and how I can incorporate them into what I'm already doing. Including how to make reading be a place that's fun, to make connections, to have conversations, and where everybody is enjoying themselves. And this is not always so easy for people that have low literacy skills themselves, who growing up always associated reading with something that they couldn't do well, something that was painful. So really, for parents whose own backgrounds include not having difficulty with reading, this is something that sometimes comes to them as a surprise, that is something that they and their children can enjoy doing together. So the overarching messages that I like to talk to parents about is that even little babies are learning from their environment at the moment they're born. And again, it's through serve and return patterns of interaction. And the positive interaction from birth is really what I'm talking about. It's not about reading the book. A book is kind of like a tool, a way to provide a foundation for You know, what are interesting different ways to interact with your child and expose them to more diverse language. Sometimes it's hard when you have a baby to think of what to say to them. And so talking about the pictures in the book can be really lovely. So I have here Why Doctors, because again, Reach Out and Read is a pediatric model, but again also refers to EI providers and other people that work with children from infancy on, is that we have repeated and consistent contact with families. We are trusted. We may be the only source of expert information, and particularly for families that live in poverty. And for people that are EI providers that are actually going into people's homes, I mean, there is no higher level of trust that you can have. And so bringing these messages and using that platform to help parents and empower them to do more serve and return interactions with their children and help their children's brains develop, I think is something that I see as a privilege. So moving on to the second part of Reach Out and Read, which is books. There are different books for different age groups. At Reach Out and Read, we start giving books at birth. This is a book actually that I wrote that is for parents and for babies. Then as kids start getting a little bit older, you know, we give cardboard books because of course parents put their babies put their cardboard books in their mouth, and so usually you know, the parents immediately get upset that their babies are putting the book in the mouth, and so I'll tell parents something like, oh, she's got great taste in books, you know, giving parents age-appropriate expectations of what babies do with books is part of what I'm going to be mentioning in a moment, and also giving age-appropriate books so that the kids don't just tear them up. As kids get a little bit older, they can be more complicated, talking about feelings, talking about animal sounds, comparisons, bedtime stories. I mean, there's so many wonderful books. It's just, it's such a pleasure actually to look at children's books. I think it just gives me joy. And then again, developmentally, you know, there's other, you know, all by myself. You know, 3-year-olds want to do everything by themselves. There's alphabet books, going to bed. So the, and then finally more about, you know, counting and curiosity and going to bed and feelings in more complex ways. So we tailor the books that we give out to the age of the children, and we also try and make sure that there are children that look different, where our patients can be reflected, so that the books can not just be windows but also mirrors. Finally, the environment. This is a picture of my clinic. These posters are actually reprints of a book called Book Fiesta by Rafael Lopez. And so all of the posters, this poster, posters all over the clinic are all about Reach Out and Read and about reading and really celebrating literacy. And this, of course, can be done at homes too, right? And it doesn't have to be fancy posters that were reprints from a fancy book. First of all, starting with turn off the TV. That's a big one. This used to be our TV in our clinic until it got stolen, and then we didn't buy a new TV. But you can having books around the house and reading creates and modeling reading. If parents are reading, that creates a literacy-rich environment. You know, this is actually, my daughter made a little book for her little toy pig. You can sort of pretend and make pretend games about books. Drawing is, of course, a precursor to writing. That's another really important part. Using books in everyday activities like cooking. And then having decorations on books that are in book decorations, like if you have a bookshelf or a little box where you can keep your books, or even taking book jackets. This is what we had before our fancy posters. We actually, one of my interns got some book jackets and then glued them on paper, colorful paper, and that's what we had on our walls. So there's lots of ways to decorate homes and to make places be literacy rich without spending a lot of money. Any questions on that?
We don't have any questions, but we have a couple of comments. So Colette shared that she finds it that some of her families have difficulty getting started reading since they weren't read to in their early years, so they didn't have a model to follow.
Yep, absolutely.
And then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say to that is that that's one of the reasons why I don't just say read to your baby. The way that I introduce the book is the first thing I do, and I'm going to mention this in a moment, actually it's a great segue to what I'm going to talk about, is that I walk into the room and I say hello and how you doing, and then the first thing I do is I give the baby the book. And then I watch what the baby does, and I will, for example, say with, let's say a 15-month-old, I'll start reading to them. It literally takes me 30 seconds. I'll say, oh, look, this is a book about words. Look at all these. Look, I see a ducky here. Look, the ducky's yellow. Ooh, where's the ducky? And then I'll say to the parent, you know, books are great. You don't even have to read the words on the page. Just play with the book and use the pictures, and that's really going to help your baby's brain develop. So it's kind of empowering parents that they don't actually have to read the words on the page. They can, but they can make up their own story. Same in the case that if I have, you know, a family that speaks Russian, and I only have books in English and Spanish. Well, I'll give them a book in English or Spanish and say, you know what, it doesn't matter, just make up your own story in Russian. So yeah, it's a great observation.
Wonderful, and yeah, Vanessa also shared kind of the her passion for talking about the picture. So no questions, just comments, it looks like.
Great. I think we're all on the same page. Oops. The other really cool thing about Reach Out and Read is that it's not just a good idea. It actually has been demonstrated to work. There's been over 15 studies that have shown that when pediatricians do Reach Out and Read, when clinics give out books and pediatricians advise parents about the importance of reading and how to do it, parents actually do it, which is awesome to know that your advice actually changes people's attitudes and practices. There are more books in the home, not just the books that we give them, but more above and beyond that. The children's attitudes change about reading, and the children's skills change. So, you know, when they ask what are their child's 3 favorite things to do, kids who have been part of Reach Out and Read, parents are much more likely to say that reading is one of them. Their favorite things to do. The other thing that is really cool, and I mentioned before about the language gap, is that children that participate in Reach Out and Read have 3 to 6 months more, are at a 3 to 6 month advantage compared to the kids that were not in the Reach Out and Read program. Meaning, so kids were 6 months more advanced in their receptive language and 3 months more advanced in their expressive language, which means that we're really helping, doing something to decrease that language gap. And that's really exciting. So that page that I just showed you is you can get online at reachoutandread.org, and it's really all the information about all the different studies that have been done on Reach Out and Read. One actually new one that just came out, which is really interesting, is that it looks like when clinics have Reach Out and Read, parents are more likely to show up to their checkups. So that's kind of a fun byproduct of the program. And as a result of all this information and this research, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is really the largest association of pediatricians in the United States, came out with a policy statement that said that all pediatricians that work in primary care should be talking to children about literacy promotion starting in infancy. So This is not just for low-income families. This is really an important thing that all pediatricians should be advising parents on, just like they advise on preventing lead poisoning and the advice on car seats. Literacy promotion is an essential component of what we're doing. So let's talk a little bit more about where you come in and how this affects early intervention in our partnership. Basically, the way that that we are partnering is that the families are going to be receiving 10 books, similar to what we do when we have a child in Reach and Read, throughout their time in early intervention. And we selected these titles to include developmentally appropriate books and bilingual titles for the children in the pilot study. In addition, we've developed some specific resources for the pilots and for the people that are in EI, how to raise a reader and what children like in books, to help families learn about Reach Out and Read, but also to have practical guidance on how to foster reading, language, and literacy. Also, the EI providers enrolled in this study will receive a handbook, a chart that will help them track the distribution of books for each child enrolled in the study, and that will have the child's name and age, a list of each of the 10 titles, with suggested age for them, and a room for notes and feedback for the parent to serve as an opportunity to discuss how reading with the child is going and offer a space for a better understanding of the family's successes and challenges with each title. And finally, the EI providers in the pilot have a section of their service guidelines dedicated to literacy promotion and partnering with Reach Out and Read that review the benefits of the program as well as the materials that I just mentioned. So while this is not technically a Reach Out and Read pilot or a program, really we're using the information and the lessons learned from Reach Out and Read to help bring through the EI providers this information to more families. So I kind of started talking about this already with regards to how to do this, because it's completely different. This is not a book giveaway program where you say you should read 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, or say, you know, this is good for your child, so you need to do this and make parents feel guilty. You want to introduce the book early in the visit and use the book as a surveillance tool. When I give the child the book, I'm not only showing the parent how to use the book, but I'm also using the book as a way to see what the child's doing. So is a 6-month-old putting the book in their mouth? Is a 1-year-old pointing, beginning to point? Is a 15-month-old beginning to name some of the easy words or things that they recognize? Or an 18-month-old? Does a 4-year-old know colors, or a 3-year-old? Do they begin to know letters? So it's not something that is one more thing to do, because a lot of times pediatricians say, you know, I just don't have time to talk about reading. I also need to talk about illness and medications and car seats, and I mean, there's a laundry list of things that we're supposed to be talking about. But the key is integrating the book and the message into what we're already doing. So if we're talking about sleep, or you can talk about bedtime stories. It's not one more thing to do. And again, also capitalizing on the teachable moments. When the parent does something well, pointing it out and saying, oh my gosh, did you see how well your child responded to that? Or look how she loves the book. Oh my goodness, she's so smart. I can see that she's going to be a great reader because look at how she's pointing already at the pictures. So I do a lot of sort of positive demonstrations and showing the parent what about their child, because it gets everybody excited and makes everybody happy, and it reinforces what the parents should be doing without telling them what they should be doing in a much less top-down approach. typically, when I start at 6-month-olds, I'll give them the book, like I mentioned before. When I'm seeing babies, because we start the Reach and Read program from birth, I don't really give the baby the book because the baby doesn't do anything with the book. Like a 6-month-old puts the book in the mouth, and then when the parent says, you know, like I said before, the parent takes it away, I can say, no, that's appropriate for your child. Newborns and younger than 6-month-olds don't do that very much, so I really talk more about when I'm examining the child, when I do more of the interactions, and I make faces, and or I might sing to the baby, or I'll talk to the baby, and then when the baby does something, I'll say, oh, did you see that? Look at how she's serving. She's going back and forth. Look at how she's communicating. It's almost as if we're having a conversation. Conversations are awesome because they help babies' brains develop. And I'm telling you this, I know that with the EI and the pilot, it's typically kids that are a little bit older. We're not really talking about infants, but you may get, you know, of course there'll be parents, there'll be families that have younger babies, and parents might ask you about that, or also parents, families with older kids as well. So as I was saying, and show parents how to what I do during the physical exam, or when I am giving the book to the baby, I'll ask the baby questions like, where's your nose? There's your nose, and wait for them to answer. Motherese is that high-pitched voice that a lot of times people just naturally take on when they speak to babies, and it's actually been shown that babies pay much more attention to that sing-songy voice that we naturally seem to do. Pointing to body parts, talk about just pointing out anything, talking about their everyday things as they're walking, as they're walking down the street. That parents can talk about things, and we'll talk about more what the parents can do. But this is what I usually kind of model when I am examining kids, and then point out that this is what they can do at home as well. This is not something that I am the only person that does it. This is very natural, comes naturally to a lot of people, but what the difference is that the things that you're doing, actually doing them with intention, and then pointing out to the parent why you're doing it and why that's important for the child's brain development. So specific advice for parents and of caregivers, a lot of this is going to overlap because a lot of it is, you know, going to be the same for one age versus another. But, you know, so for babies, paying attention to their cues, having conversations, narrating your day. So now we're going to the kitchen and we're going to get some milk, you know, and pointing to the milk and showing the milk, you know, things like that. Asking lots of questions and then answering them yourselves, singing, talking about feelings. You know, babies, they have all sorts of faces that they make, and sometimes, you know, obviously it's just gas, but it's good to start naming, you know, oh, are you sad? Or, oh, I know you're mad, you're hungry, you must be frustrated. And those kinds of things are really helpful that parents might not realize that they should be doing. And I do have a lot of parents that adore their children. I know these children are very well cared for, but I don't hear as much of the language as I hear in other families. And so I like to encourage that love to come out through language as well. I want to show you a video. Let's try this video. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to show much of the video. But this is a grandfather reading with a newborn.
Okay, Dr. Glusman, I think you're on mute. We cannot hear you. There
okay,
you go.
how's that? There.
Better.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So as kids get a little bit older, they're responding a lot more. They're not going to sit down and read a book like an older kid. A lot of times I'll have a parent of a 15-month-old or an 18-month-old say, my kid doesn't like books. He hates books. He doesn't sit down for a book. And I'll say, you know what, most 18-month-olds don't sit down for anything, let alone a book, and especially if you're not making it, if it's not something that they've been doing for a while, and also if it's not something that you're making interesting and exciting. So oftentimes I'll just start modeling for the parent, you know, or give the book to the child and the child walks around, and then I actually had this happen where, you know, one of my residents that I teach in pediatrics said, oh no, the parent says he doesn't like books, and so I came back with the resident and I gave the child the book, and then the kid just sat down on the floor and started looking at the pictures and pointing to them, and I turned around to the parent and said, oh my gosh, look at that, he really does like books. Yeah, it's normal. 15-month-olds don't sit down for any length of time. Keep on doing it. Make it fun. And that kind of allows the parent to sort of feel like, oh, it's not that there's something wrong with their kid, that their kid doesn't like books. It's just that this is something that's developmentally normal. But that doesn't mean that they should stop reading. I don't really have a lot of time to go through all of the detailed. Let's not go through the videos, but these two other videos are it's videos of parents who are doing a really nice job getting their toddlers involved with reading, with the books, even at, you know, pretty young ages.
Okay, this was the poll that I wanted to throw in here real quick. If you could just answer this one really quick for me so I can get an idea. We've never shown videos before, and I want to just see how everyone's experience was. I appreciate the comments that some of you had. Please feel free to share. I don't want to take up much more of Dr. Glusman's presentation time, but if you would, please be so kind. A few more seconds to respond to this. All right, let me just post that up real quick. All right. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. All right. Sorry, I'll move on to the next slide.
All right. So same with preschoolers. I mean, again, it's the same basic concept. It's serve and return, but the serve and return become more complex. So cooking together, playing pretend games, playing games with rules, counting, and not making it so that you're like school, like you have to count. It's really sort of counting things and seeing, you know, piling things up and learning through games. Is one of the things that I really like to talk to parents about, because sometimes parents will say, oh, I've got flashcards for my preschoolers so that they can learn to read, and that I think is counterproductive unless it's a game where you're running around and then finding the flashcard. But just to sit and rote memorize sight words, I think is actually counterproductive to children's learning. The key is interaction, complexity. What's going to happen next? Would you do such a thing? What if a monster came to your house? Again, creating a safe environment where kids can play and explore is key. So I told you about my daughter Abby when she was a baby. This is her when she was teaching preschool, and loved to read with the kids in her class. As kids get older, it's good to just keep on reading. Even kids who are able to read themselves, the more books you read above their level, the better they learn in their vocabulary, as well as their desire to want to improve on their reading. So So that, I told you about Reach Out and Read. Reach Out and Read is a program that started in one clinic in Boston and now is in over 7,000. No, there's over it's over 7,000 clinics in the state. Reach Out and Read, in the United States. Reach Out and Read Illinois, and I am the medical director of Reach Out and Read Illinois. We have over 100 clinics right now that have the Reach Out and Read program. We give out about 135,000 books per year, along with the advice that I talked to you about. As I said, it's one of my favorite things in my clinic, and it's one of I can't even imagine practicing pediatrics without a book in my hand. The take-home point that I talk to parents about, that I talk to pediatricians about, that I want to sort of reinforce is that encouraging reciprocal interactions with infants, babies, toddlers, and preschoolers and school-age kids is really important. It's not just about reading. It's really using the book as a prop and playing, talking, singing, and that increases language and language processing, vocabulary, and school readiness, and encourages warmth and strengthens relationships, because it's not just about building vocabularies, it's about building relationships and promoting resiliency in children. Just to close up, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. What questions do you all have?
Okay, we've got a lot of folks that have questions about can they access. So, and I don't know, I think there's two different programs. There's the ROR program and then the Lead Pilot cooperative program. So maybe you can talk about who can access what.
So right now, the pilot program, I think Kylan is going to be able to, talk a little bit more about the pilot program. I think that it looks like lead of greater than 5 is going to become mandated automatic EI referral. So it's not going to eventually, and it looks like it's coming relatively soon. It's going to be something that all EI providers are going to end up taking care of kids who don't necessarily have obvious delays but are at risk based on their lead levels. So I think that the pilot is really to figure out how these things work together, what are the best ways to help EI providers best help these families, and I think that this is what we're trying to figure out. In terms of Reach Out and Read, in order to become a Reach Out and Read clinic, there is an application process that goes through the national office, and once you apply, then you become a site. The biggest issue with becoming a site is funding, because books, although we are able to get them at a really low price, we can get them for about $3, $3.50 per book, sometimes less. We still, when we're giving out hundreds of thousands of books, it becomes very expensive. So we accept sites based on their ability to fundraise for themselves for their books, because it's actually a very cheap program if you think about the benefits. The providers are all doing this as part of what they're already doing, so it's not extra time, it's not extra cost, and most of the cost goes to the book distribution and the actual books themselves. So in terms of access for EI providers, I think that's going to become an issue also in terms of funding, in terms of what books, how many books you're going to be able to distribute to families. Kaylin, did I answer?
So, hi, this is Kaylin. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Sorry, I've been having some technical difficulties on my end. So I just wanted to clarify that for the early interventionists that are a part of our LEAD and EI pilot program, currently it is in CFC 1, 7, and 9. So if you are a member of those CFCs and you are a part of our pilot, meaning that you are willing to provide services to families that are enrolled in the pilot, for automatic eligibility based on a blood level of 5 or above. You have access to distribute books to families that are enrolled in the pilot study specifically. So each family in the pilot study, they've signed a consent form with Erickson Institute to be a part of that study, and a part of the benefits is that every family gets 10 books during their course of EI. So if they are young and coming in and they'll be in the program for 2 years, those 10 titles will be distributed throughout those 2 years. If they're a little bit older, they can be distributed within the remainder of time that that child is eligible for EI until they turn 36 months. All of the books that you have available to distribute to families are at the CSC office themselves. If you are a member of the pilot, you're also on our Office 360 group files group, and in those folders, we have our book chart that goes through there's a space for the child's name and their date of birth and all of that good stuff, as well as all of the titles that we have as a part of the pilot. And a space to talk about when they've been distributed and any notes that you'd like to make for the family or for yourself to check back on. So that's a nice opportunity to do some of, to just write little notes for yourself to maybe follow up on some of the strategies that Dr. Glusman presented today, and use that as a point of engagement for families moving forward, and even hear their feedback about what they liked about the book, what they didn't, how, what were the things that they did with the book when they got home, all of those good things, as well as reach out and read specific materials, how to raise a reader and what children like in books, and both of those materials are also really great to go through with families and help them think about reading and engaging in literature in new and exciting ways that are going to fit their needs and their lifestyles. So I just wanted to clarify on the pilot side, that's what we're working with now. We wish that we were able to provide this to all CFCs, and certainly with future funding and efforts and our hopes of getting legislation passed that makes early intervention and automatic eligibility for children with blood levels of 5 or above, it's something to look forward to in the future. But as of right now, it's just for our pilots. So if there are any additional questions, please feel free to ask me, or you can reach out to me on the group files or my email, ksafransky@legalcounsel.org.
But I also think that many of these techniques are things that you can incorporate in other ways as well. So, so while it's great to have the books, some of my clinics or clinics that are applying for Reach Out and Read that can't get the books right away can still sort of go through the training and sort of start giving the advice to families even without the book, and then using, maybe they have a book at home or other things that that you might have, a toy, a magazine, anything that's within reach that can be used as a subject of serve and return interaction.
All right. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful, informative webinar. We look forward to hearing more information about the pilots and the process of building better brains. I think you gave you gave participants a lot of great ideas on how to approach this with families, and we thank you so much for your time, Dr. Glusman and Kaylin. And with that being said, our webinar has ended. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.